Major Asa Johnston counted the riders on the distant ridge. 30, maybe 35. A small band of guerrillas silhouetted against the Missouri sky. He looked back at his own men. 147 Union cavalry, trained soldiers, armed with carbines and sabers, ready for a fight. The numbers were overwhelming. 5-1 odds in his favor. This would not be a battle. This would be a rout. Johnston smiled. In 20 minutes, 124 of his men would be dead. Johnston himself would be among them, and the 30 guerrillas on that ridge would ride away without losing a single man in the initial charge. This is the story of how the right numbers and the wrong decision created one of the most lopsided massacres of the American Civil War. The morning of September 27, 1864, had already been catastrophic. Word reached the Union garrison at Sturgeon, Missouri around noon. A train had been stopped at Centralia. 24 Union soldiers had been pulled from the cars and executed. The town had been looted. Civilians had been terrorized. The perpetrator was well known. William Anderson. Bloody Bill, the most feared guerrilla leader in Missouri. Major Asa Vance Johnston received the report and made an immediate decision. He would pursue. He would catch these murderers. He would bring them to justice. It was the decision of a brave man. It was also the decision that would kill him. Johnston was not a fool. He was 39 years old, a veteran of multiple engagements. He had served with distinction in the Missouri State Militia before transferring to regular Union forces. He knew how to lead men. He knew how to fight. But he did not know Bill Anderson, and he did not understand that the rules he had learned about cavalry warfare did not apply to guerrilla combat in Missouri. That gap in understanding would cost him everything. The Union cavalry rode out of Sturgeon in early afternoon. 147 men on horseback, armed with Springfield carbines, the standard issue for cavalry, single-shot weapons that required the soldier to reload after each firing, effective at range, devastating in a disciplined volley, but slow, terribly slow when facing an enemy that did not fight by conventional rules. Johnston led from the front. He was that kind of officer. The kind who believed that men followed courage, and courage meant visibility. He would be first into the fight, first to die, but he did not know that yet. They found the trail easily. Bill Anderson had made no attempt to hide his path. The guerrillas had ridden south from Centralia, leaving tracks that any competent tracker could follow. It was almost as if they wanted to be found. They did. Johnston interpreted the obvious trail as evidence of panic. The guerrillas were fleeing. They knew Union forces would pursue. They were trying to escape before the noose tightened. He was wrong. Bill Anderson was not fleeing. He was leading, drawing the Union cavalry away from town, away from witnesses, into open ground where the fight would happen on his terms. It was a trap, and Johnston was riding directly into it. The pursuit lasted 2 hours. Johnston pushed his men hard. He wanted to catch the guerrillas before nightfall, before they could scatter into the woods and vanish like smoke, before they could escape justice for what they had done at Centralia. His men were tired. They had been on patrol since morning. Now they were riding at speed across rough terrain, chasing an enemy that seemed always just out of reach. Some of the junior officers suggested caution. They did not like how easy the trail was to follow. They did not like how the guerrillas seemed to be staying just far enough ahead to remain visible, but never close enough to engage. Johnston dismissed their concerns. He had the numbers, he had the training. He had the righteous anger of a man hunting murderers. What he did not have was an understanding of what he was riding toward. Around 4 in the afternoon, the cavalry crested a low ridge and saw them. Bill Anderson's guerrillas, 30 men on horseback arranged in a loose line about 400 yards away. They were not running. They were not hiding. They were waiting. Johnston halted his column and studied the enemy. 30 against 147. The arithmetic was simple. Even accounting for the guerrillas' reputation, even accounting for their ferocity, the numbers were decisively in his favor. He made his decision. The order came clearly across the afternoon air. Dismount. Form a skirmish line. Prepare to fire on my command. It was standard cavalry doctrine. When facing a stationary enemy, dismount and use your carbines at range. The discipline of trained soldiers would overcome the chaos of irregular fighters. Volley fire would break their charge before it started. Johnston had used this tactic before. It had worked before. It would work again. Except it would not. Because Johnston did not understand what he was facing, did not understand the weapons his enemy carried, did not understand that dismounting his cavalry was not a tactical advantage. It was a death sentence. Let us talk about the weapons. Union cavalry carried Springfield carbines, single-shot weapons that fired a .58 caliber round, accurate, powerful, capable of killing at 300 yards or more, but single-shot. After each firing, the soldier had to reload, open the breech, remove the spent cartridge, insert a new round, close the breech, cock the hammer, aim, fire. In the hands of a well-trained soldier, this process took about 15 seconds. In the chaos of combat, with hands shaking and smoke obscuring vision, it could take 30 seconds or more. Bill Anderson's guerrillas carried revolvers, Colt Navy revolvers mostly, 6 shots before reloading. And each guerrilla carried multiple weapons. Some carried 4 revolvers, some carried 6. Some had pistols tucked into every pocket and sash, ready to draw and fire. A Union soldier could fire 1 shot every 15 to 30 seconds. A guerrilla could fire 24 shots in the same time. This was not a minor advantage. This was not a small edge. This was the difference between life and death. Johnston did not know about the revolvers, or rather, he knew, but did not understand. He had heard that guerrillas carried multiple pistols, had read reports about their firepower, but he had never faced them in combat. He thought of revolvers as close-range weapons, inaccurate beyond 30 yards, useful for finishing off wounded enemies or fighting in confined spaces, but not for open battle. He was partially right. Revolvers were less accurate at range than carbines, but accuracy mattered less when you could fire 24 times, while your enemy fired once. And accuracy mattered even less when you were charging on horseback, while your enemy stood still on the ground. Johnston was about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way possible. The Union cavalry dismounted. 147 men swung down from their horses. Every 4th man became a horseholder, leading 4 horses to the rear while his comrades formed the skirmish line. This was standard procedure. You could not fire accurately from a moving horse. Dismounting allowed disciplined volley fire. It had worked in dozens of engagements, but it also meant something else. It meant that 147 mounted cavalry had just become about 100 infantry. Slower, less mobile, unable to retreat quickly if things went wrong. And things were about to go very wrong. Bill Anderson watched the Union cavalry dismount. He sat on his horse 400 yards away and watched through the afternoon haze as the blue-clad soldiers climbed down from their mounts. As they formed their line, as they raised their carbines, he smiled. Later, survivors would describe that smile, would speak of it in hushed tones around campfires and in hospital wards, the smile of a man who knew he had already won. Johnston had just made the fatal error. By dismounting, he had surrendered mobility. By forming a skirmish line, he had created a stationary target. By preparing for a defensive engagement, he had given Bill Anderson exactly what he wanted, an enemy that could not run. Bill Anderson was not a military genius. He had never attended West Point, never studied the theories of Napoleon or Frederick the Great, never learned the formal doctrines of cavalry warfare that Johnston had memorized. But he understood one thing that Johnston did not: speed kills. In guerrilla warfare, the side that moves faster wins. The side that can close distance before the enemy reloads wins. The side that hits hard and keeps hitting wins. Johnston had just given up his speed, had traded his horses for a firing line, had chosen discipline over mobility. It was the wrong choice. The command came from Bill Anderson. One word, screamed across the Missouri grassland: charge. 80 guerrillas spurred their horses forward. Wait, 80. Johnston had counted 30. Where had the others come from? They had been hiding, in the trees to the left, in the ravine to the right, waiting for the Union cavalry to commit, waiting for them to dismount, waiting for the trap to close. Now they emerged. 50 additional riders joining the original 30. The odds had shifted in an instant, from 5 to 1 in Johnston's favor to almost even numbers, and the guerrillas were mounted, and the Union soldiers were not. The charge covered 400 yards. At full gallop, a horse can cover that distance in about 30 seconds. maybe 40 on rough terrain, less than a minute either way. Less than a minute for 100 Union soldiers to stop 80 charging horsemen. They had carbines, single-shot carbines. They could fire once, maybe twice if they were very fast and very calm. Most of them would not be calm. The first volley crashed out. Union soldiers fired their carbines in something approaching unison. Smoke billowed across the skirmish line. Lead flew toward the charging guerrillas. Some shots hit. Horses went down. A few riders tumbled from their saddles, but most of the guerrillas kept coming, and now the Union soldiers had to reload. 15 seconds to reload a Springfield carbine. That was the training standard. Under ideal conditions on the firing range with no one trying to kill you, these were not ideal conditions. 80 horsemen were thundering toward them. The ground was shaking. Dust was rising. The guerrillas were screaming, and they were firing back. The revolvers opened up at 200 yards, not accurate at that range, not precise, but there were 80 guerrillas and each one carried 4 to 6 revolvers, 300 shots in the first exchange, maybe more. The air filled with lead. Union soldiers started falling before they could finish reloading. Men who had survived the first charge now dropped as pistol balls found them. The skirmish line began to waver, and the guerrillas kept coming. 100 yards. The charge had covered 300 yards. The guerrillas had taken casualties, maybe a dozen men down, maybe fewer. But they were still coming. And the Union soldiers had not finished reloading. Some had. The fastest, the calmest, the most experienced had managed to reload and fire a second shot. A few more guerrillas fell, but most of the Union soldiers were still fumbling with their carbines, still trying to remember the steps they had practiced 1,000 times, still trying to make their hands stop shaking long enough to insert a cartridge. The revolvers kept firing. At 100 yards, a Colt Navy becomes much more accurate. Guerrillas who had been spraying lead now began aiming, picking targets, making each shot count. More Union soldiers fell. 50 yards. The guerrillas were close enough now that the Union soldiers could see their faces, could see the hatred in their eyes, could see the pistols in their hands smoking and ready. Some soldiers broke. They threw down their carbines and ran for the horses that were being held at the rear, ran for any cover they could find, ran because standing still meant dying. The skirmish line collapsed. What had been a disciplined military formation became a mob. Men pushing past each other, men stumbling over the bodies of the fallen, men screaming for help that would not come, and the guerrillas reached them. Close combat with guerrillas was not like anything the Union soldiers had trained for. In conventional warfare, a cavalry charge would hit an infantry line, and there would be a moment of impact, a moment of chaos. Then the line would either hold or break, and the battle would resolve one way or another. This was different. The guerrillas did not stop when they reached the Union line. They rode through it, past it, around it, firing their revolvers at point-blank range, slashing with sabers and bowie knives, killing with the efficiency that spoke of long practice. And they kept moving. A guerrilla would empty one revolver, shove it into his belt, draw another and keep firing. 6 shots, then another 6, then another 6. The guns seemed endless. The Union soldiers had one shot. Major Johnston tried to rally his men. He stood in the center of the chaos, shouting orders that no one could hear, waving his saber, trying to form some kind of resistance, trying to create a point around which his soldiers could gather. It was brave. It was also futile. The guerrillas saw him, saw the officer's insignia, saw the man giving orders. They converged. Johnston went down under a hail of pistol fire. Multiple shots, from multiple directions. He never had a chance to defend himself. Later, when the burial detail came, they would find his body near the center of the field, stripped of valuables, shot so many times that they would lose count of the wounds. He had led from the front. He had died at the front. It was the only promise he had kept that day. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. Some accounts say 15, some say less than 10. The exact duration is impossible to determine because so few Union soldiers survived to give testimony. 20 minutes, maybe less. In that time, 124 Union soldiers died, 124 out of 147, an 84% casualty rate. In less time than it takes to eat a meal, Johnston's command had been annihilated. The guerrillas lost 2 men, 2. Some accounts say 3, a few say as many as 5. But the most reliable estimates put guerrilla casualties at 2 dead in the entire engagement. 2 dead versus 124. The disparity is almost impossible to comprehend. It does not fit the usual calculus of warfare. It suggests not a battle but an execution, and in many ways that is exactly what it was. Where did the survivors go? 23 Union soldiers escaped the massacre. Some fled during the initial charge and kept running until they reached safety. Some hid among the dead, playing corpse until the guerrillas left. Some were spared by luck or circumstance. One soldier, a private named Benton, survived by hiding in a ravine for 4 hours. He lay in the mud and listened to the guerrillas hunting for survivors. Heard the shots that finished off the wounded. Heard the laughter as they stripped the dead. He did not move until long after dark. When he finally crawled out, the field was silent except for the crows. Let us return to the moment of the fatal decision. Johnston stood on that ridge looking at 30 guerrillas 400 yards away. He had 147 men. The arithmetic was simple, but arithmetic is not tactics. The question he should have asked was not how many men he had. The question was how many effective weapons he could bring to bear in the time available. His 147 men had 147 carbines, single-shot weapons. In a 30-second engagement, they could fire perhaps twice, 300 shots total, maybe. The 30 guerrillas on that ridge had approximately 150 revolvers between them. Each revolver held 6 rounds. In a 30-second engagement, they could fire most of those rounds, 900 shots, maybe more. And they were mounted, and they were charging. The arithmetic that mattered was not how many men Johnston had. It was how many bullets his men could put down range before the guerrillas reached them. By that measure, Johnston was outnumbered 3-1. Why did Johnston dismount? It is easy to criticize him from the safety of history, easy to say he should have known better, easy to point out the obvious tactical error, but Johnston was following doctrine, standard cavalry doctrine that had worked in battles across the Civil War. When facing a defensive position or a prepared enemy, dismount and use your carbines. The discipline of trained soldiers firing in volleys could break any charge before it started. This was the theory, this was what the manuals said. The manuals did not account for enemies who carried 24 shots each and attacked at full gallop. Johnston did what he had been trained to do. It just happened to be exactly the wrong thing. There was another option. Johnston could have charged. It sounds counterintuitive. Charging 30 men with 147 should have been even more decisive. But consider the dynamics. A cavalry charge by the Union would have closed the distance before the guerrillas could coordinate, would have forced a melee rather than a shooting engagement, would have let Johnston's numerical advantage matter. Yes, he would have taken casualties. Yes, some guerrillas would have escaped, but the mathematics of close combat favor the larger force. Instead of a firefight where weapons mattered more than numbers, it would have been a brawl where numbers mattered more than weapons. Johnston might have lost 20 men instead of 124, but he did not charge. He dismounted, and history unfolded accordingly. Some of Johnston's officers argued, not publicly, not in terms that would challenge his authority, but quietly. In the moments before the dismount order, a few voices suggested alternatives. Lieutenant Carter, according to one survivor's account, rode up beside Johnston and said something about keeping the horses. Johnston waved him off. Another officer, whose name has been lost to history, reportedly asked whether they should wait for reinforcements. Johnston said there was no time. The guerrillas would escape. The irony is bitter. By not waiting, by not thinking, by not considering alternatives, Johnston ensured that the guerrillas would not only escape, but would do so having destroyed his entire command. Jesse James was in that charge. This detail often gets overlooked in discussions of the battle. Jesse James, who would become the most famous outlaw in American history, rode with Bill Anderson that day. He was 17 years old. He had been riding with the guerrillas for less than a year. He had seen violence before, had participated in raids, but nothing on this scale. Years later, Jesse would rarely speak of Centralia. When asked about the charge, he would give brief answers and change the subject. Historians have speculated about why. Perhaps the memory was painful. Perhaps he was ashamed of what he had done. Perhaps he simply did not want to relive those 20 minutes when 124 men died around him. Or perhaps he remembered too well. Perhaps the efficiency of the killing, the ease with which trained soldiers fell before guerrilla revolvers, had taught him something he never forgot. Jesse James learned his trade at Centralia, the quick draw, the multiple weapons, the ruthless efficiency, the willingness to kill without hesitation. Bill Anderson was his teacher. The lessons lasted a lifetime. Frank James was there too, the older brother. 21 years old, more experienced than Jesse. More calculating. Frank later gave interviews about the war, about his time with the guerrillas, about Centralia. He described the charge in clinical terms, the distance, the timing, the way the Union soldiers started to break before the guerrillas even reached them. They knew they were dead, Frank said. You could see it in their eyes. They knew they had made a mistake and there was nothing they could do to fix it. Frank did not express regret, did not apologize, did not suggest that anything could have been done differently. It was war, he said. They came to kill us. We killed them first. That is how war works. The simplicity of his assessment is chilling, but it is also accurate. Let us talk about what happened after the charge. The initial clash lasted perhaps 5 minutes. 5 minutes of chaos and gunfire and death. 5 minutes in which the Union skirmish line ceased to exist. But the battle was not over. Surviving soldiers scattered across the field. Some ran north, some ran south. Some ran in no particular direction, just away from the killing. The guerrillas pursued. This was not mercy. This was thoroughness. Bill Anderson did not want survivors, did not want witnesses who could identify his men, did not want Union soldiers returning to spread tales of the massacre. He wanted them all dead. The pursuit lasted longer than the battle. For perhaps an hour after the initial charge, guerrillas rode across the Missouri countryside hunting fleeing soldiers. They found them in ravines, in thickets, in farmhouses where they had sought shelter. Each discovery ended the same way: shots, sometimes screams, then silence. The 23 who survived did so by luck as much as skill. By hiding in places the guerrillas did not think to look. By playing dead convincingly. By being overlooked in the chaos. 23 out of 147. 84% casualties. What did the guerrillas do with the bodies? They stripped them: uniforms, weapons, boots, valuables, anything useful or saleable. The dead were picked clean before the guerrillas rode away. Some bodies were mutilated. Accounts vary on how many and how badly. But the pattern that had emerged at the train platform continued on the battlefield. This was not just killing. This was a message. To Union soldiers who might pursue in the future. To commanders who might order such pursuits. To anyone who thought that numerical superiority was enough to defeat bloody Bill Anderson. The message was clear. Come after us, and this is what happens. The news of the disaster reached Union headquarters that evening. A survivor had made it to the nearest garrison, wounded, terrified, barely coherent, but alive enough to tell what had happened. 147 sent, 23 returned. Major Johnston dead, the entire command destroyed. The officers who heard the report did not believe it at first. The numbers seemed impossible. How could 30 guerrillas defeat 147 trained cavalry? Then more survivors trickled in. Then the burial details went out. Then the truth became undeniable. Johnston had led his men into a massacre. The aftermath was recrimination. Who had ordered the pursuit? Who had approved the tactics? Who had failed to warn Johnston about the guerrillas' firepower? Questions flew up and down the chain of command. Reports were demanded. Explanations were expected. But there was no one to blame except Johnston himself, and he was dead. He had made the decisions, had ignored advice, had followed doctrine that did not apply, had led his men to destruction. The only person who could have done differently was beyond all punishment and all reward. Bill Anderson rode away from Centralia with his men intact. He had started the day with the train massacre, had killed 24 unarmed soldiers on the platform, had looted the town, had terrorized the civilians. Then he had destroyed an entire cavalry unit sent to stop him. September 27, 1864 was the most successful day of his career as a guerrilla. More than 150 Union soldiers dead, no significant losses on his side. It was also the day that sealed his fate. The Union Army could not allow such a defeat to stand unanswered, could not permit a guerrilla leader to humiliate them so completely, could not let Bill Anderson continue to ride free. The hunt intensified. More troops were allocated. More rewards were offered. 6 weeks later, Bill Anderson would ride into an ambush near Albany, Missouri. He would take 4 bullets and die in a field, just like the men he had killed. But on September 27th, he was victorious, he was triumphant. He was the most dangerous man in Missouri, and he knew it. Let us examine the mathematics more closely. 147 Union soldiers, each carrying 1 carbine with approximately 20 rounds of ammunition, total firepower, 147 shots per reload cycle, 80 guerrillas, each carrying an average of 5 revolvers with 6 rounds each, total firepower, approximately 2,400 shots before reloading. The ratio is not 5 to 1 in Johnston's favor. It is 16 to 1 in Bill Anderson's favor. This is what Johnston did not understand. This is what killed his men. This is the fundamental miscalculation that turned certain victory into catastrophic defeat. Numbers of men do not equal numbers of bullets, and in a firefight, bullets are what matter. Why did the Union cavalry carry single-shot carbines? It was a matter of logistics and doctrine. The Springfield carbine was reliable, accurate, easy to manufacture, easy to supply. The Union Army could produce them in quantities that would have been impossible for more complex weapons. Revolvers were harder to make, more expensive, less reliable in wet conditions, and they required more training to use effectively. For conventional warfare, carbines made sense. In a set-piece battle, disciplined volley fire could break enemy formations. The single-shot limitation was offset by coordination and training, but guerrilla warfare was not conventional. Guerrillas did not form neat lines, did not stand still to be shot, did not play by the rules that made carbines effective. They charged, they moved. They closed distance before volley fire could take effect. Against that kind of enemy, the Union cavalry's weapons were almost useless. Could Johnston have retreated? This is another question that haunts the historical record. When he saw the guerrillas waiting on that ridge, Johnston could have turned around, could have ridden back to Sturgeon, could have reported the enemy position and waited for reinforcements. But he did not. Why? Pride, perhaps. He had come to catch guerrillas. Turning around without engaging would have felt like failure, would have looked like cowardice, orders, perhaps. He had been sent to pursue. Pursuit meant engagement. Breaking off would have required explanation. Confidence, certainly. He had the numbers, he had the training. He believed he could win. The combination of pride and confidence killed him, killed 123 of his men, created one of the worst defeats the Union suffered in Missouri. If he had retreated, Bill Anderson would still have won the day. The train massacre would still have happened, but Johnston and his men would have lived to fight another day. Instead, they became statistics in Bill Anderson's legend. The psychological impact of the defeat was immense. News of Centralia spread through the Union forces in Missouri like a disease. Soldiers heard about the numbers, 147 against 30, heard about the outcome, 124 dead. The mathematics did not make sense. How could 30 beat 147? But the dead were real. The survivors were real. The empty bunks in garrisons across Missouri were real. Fear took root. Some soldiers refused to pursue guerrillas after hearing about Centralia. They remembered Johnston, remembered his confidence, remembered how certainty had become disaster. Officers became cautious. They demanded larger forces before engaging, demanded intelligence about enemy numbers, demanded assurances that they would not meet Johnston's fate. Bill Anderson had won more than a battle. He had won a psychological victory that would echo for months. Let us return to the charge itself. 80 horsemen riding at full gallop toward 100 dismounted soldiers, the ground shaking with hoofbeats, the air filling with smoke and screams. What did it look like from the Union side? Imagine standing in that skirmish line. You have fired your one shot. Your hands are shaking as you try to reload. Around you, your comrades are doing the same. And they are coming. 80 riders. getting larger with every second. Firing as they ride, men beside you are falling. Your carbine is not loaded. You are fumbling with the cartridge. Your fingers will not work properly. They are 200 yards away now, 150, 100. You can see their faces, see the revolvers in their hands, see the smoke from their constant firing. Your carbine is still not loaded. 50 yards, 30 yards. You throw down the useless weapon and run. What did it look like from the guerrilla side? Imagine riding in that charge. Your horse beneath you, moving at full speed. Your revolver in your hand, firing at the blue shapes ahead. You have done this before. Not at this scale, but the mechanics are the same. Ride fast, fire fast. Do not stop until they are all down. The Union soldiers are standing still. They are trying to reload. Some are running already. This is not a battle. This is a hunt. You reach the skirmish line. Men are scattering in every direction. You pick a target, fire, pick another, fire. Your revolver clicks empty. You shove it into your belt and draw another. 6 more shots, then another. The mathematics are simple. They cannot shoot back fast enough. They cannot run fast enough. They are already dead. They just do not know it yet. You ride through them and keep killing. Thomas Goodman was not at the cavalry battle. He was the survivor from the train platform, the one Bill Anderson had spared for prisoner exchange. He was still with the guerrillas when Johnston's cavalry charged, but he did not participate in the fighting. He watched. Later he would describe what he saw, would speak of the efficiency of the slaughter, would try to explain how quickly 124 men could die when the circumstances were wrong. It was not a battle, he said. It was a machine. They had built a machine for killing, and the cavalry rode right into it. Goodman's testimony is valuable because he had no stake in the outcome. He was a prisoner, not a participant. His observations were those of a witness, not a combatant. And what he witnessed was the complete destruction of a Union cavalry unit in less time than it takes to saddle a horse. Why did the guerrillas not lose more men? The question seems almost naive. Of course they lost men. Combat always produces casualties on both sides, but the numbers say otherwise. 2 dead, maybe 3, against 124. The answer lies in the dynamics of the engagement. The Union soldiers had one chance to kill guerrillas, one volley before the charge reached them. After that, they were fighting for survival, not for victory. That first volley did kill some guerrillas. Maybe a dozen horses went down, maybe 10 riders were hit. But horses can be replaced and many of the wounded guerrillas could still fight. After the first volley, the killing went in one direction. Guerrillas on horseback, firing rapidly, moving constantly. Union soldiers on foot, unable to reload, unable to run fast enough, unable to fight back effectively. The mathematics of the engagement meant that casualties would be almost entirely Union, and they were. The burial detail arrived the next morning. Soldiers from a neighboring garrison sent to recover the dead. They had heard the reports, had been warned about what they would find, but warnings could not prepare them for the reality. 124 bodies scattered across a Missouri field. Some lay where they had fallen in the skirmish line. Some lay hundreds of yards away, cut down while running. Some lay in clusters where groups of soldiers had tried to make a stand. All of them stripped, all of them dead, all of them victims of a 20-minute massacre. The burial detail worked in silence. What was there to say? Major Johnston was found near the center of the field. His body had been particularly brutalized. Multiple gunshot wounds, signs of close-range firing. He had died fighting, the burial detail assumed, had died trying to rally his men. It was a comforting story. It might even have been true. What was certainly true was that Johnston had led his men to disaster, had made decisions that cost 124 lives, had followed doctrine that did not fit the situation. He paid for those decisions with his own life, but that payment did not bring back the others. The families received letters in the following weeks. Killed in action, died in service to his country, brave to the end. The letters were kind. They offered condolences. They said nothing about the tactical error that had made the deaths inevitable. Some families learned the truth anyway. Word spread. Survivors talked. Newspapers printed accounts of the disaster. Those families carried an additional burden, the knowledge that their loved ones had not died in a fair fight, had not fallen in battle against superior forces, had been led into a trap, by a commander who did not understand what he was facing. That knowledge did not help the grieving, did not provide closure, did not make the loss any easier to bear. What lessons were learned? The Union Army did study the engagement, did try to understand what had gone wrong, did make changes to tactics and doctrine. Some units began carrying revolvers alongside their carbines, others trained in fighting from horseback rather than dismounted. The vulnerability to guerrilla tactics was recognized and addressed. But these changes came too late for Johnston's command. And in many ways, they came too late for Missouri. The war was in its final year. The Confederacy was collapsing. The guerrilla war would end not because of tactical improvements, but because the larger conflict was ending. The lessons of Centralia would be remembered, but they would not be applied until future wars, future conflicts, future mistakes. Bill Anderson became even more feared after the Cavalry battle. If he had been notorious before, he was legendary now. The man who had destroyed an entire Union cavalry unit with 30 men, the man who had turned 5-to-1 odds into a massacre going the other way. Stories about him grew. Some were true, some were exaggerated, some were invented entirely. But all of them agreed on one thing. Bill Anderson could not be defeated by conventional tactics. He was too fast, too fierce, too willing to take risks that conventional soldiers would not consider. Fighting him required different thinking, different weapons, different approaches, or overwhelming force. 6 weeks later, the Union would try the latter. The ambush that killed Bill Anderson was not a fair fight. Union forces had learned from Centralia, had learned that small units pursuing guerrillas would be destroyed, had learned that the mathematics of revolvers versus carbines favored the guerrillas. So they changed the mathematics. 300 soldiers, hidden along a road they knew Bill would travel, waiting until he was in the kill zone before opening fire. Bill Anderson rode into that ambush on October 27, 1864. Exactly 1 month after his triumph at Centralia, he took 4 bullets and died in a field. The Union had learned their lesson. They had just needed to pay for it with 124 lives first. Let us return to the question of tactics. Johnston's decision to dismount was not stupid. It was not cowardly. It was not even unusual. It was simply wrong. Wrong for this situation, wrong for this enemy, wrong for these weapons. The tragedy is that Johnston could not have known it was wrong. His training told him it was right. His experience told him it was right. Everything he had learned about cavalry warfare told him it was right. But guerrilla warfare follows different rules, and those rules had not been written into any manual Johnston had read. He died because he followed doctrine that did not apply, and 123 of his men died with him. Could it have ended differently? Imagine if Johnston had charged instead of dismounting. 147 cavalry thundering toward 80 guerrillas. The distance closing in seconds. No time for the guerrillas to coordinate. No time for them to concentrate their fire. Would some Union soldiers have died? Yes, probably many. But the guerrillas would have had to choose. Stand and fight in close combat, where numbers matter, or scatter and flee, giving up the field. Either way, Johnston's command would have survived. Bloodied, perhaps, diminished but intact. Instead, by dismounting, Johnston turned his cavalry into slow-moving targets, gave the guerrillas time to charge, gave them the engagement they wanted. The decision to dismount was the decision that killed them all. There is a principle in warfare that Johnston forgot. Never give your enemy the battle they want. Bill Anderson wanted a shooting engagement, wanted the Union soldiers standing still, wanted time to close the distance and bring his revolvers to bear. Johnston gave him exactly that. A smarter approach would have been to give Bill the battle he did not want. A cavalry melee, a confused close-quarters fight where numbers mattered more than firepower. But Johnston did not think like that. He thought like a conventional officer facing a conventional enemy, and his conventional thinking killed him. The survivors lived with what they had seen, 23 men who had watched 124 comrades die, who had run for their lives, who had hidden among the dead or in ravines or anywhere they could find shelter. They carried the memory of Centralia for the rest of their lives. Some became bitter, some became cautious, some never spoke of it again, but all of them remembered the lesson. Numbers do not matter if tactics are wrong. Training does not matter if weapons are mismatched. Confidence does not matter if the enemy understands something you do not. Johnston had been confident. His men had been trained, his numbers had been overwhelming, and it had meant nothing. The broader war continued. Centralia was not a strategic defeat. The Union was winning the war, would continue to win, would accept the Confederacy's surrender less than a year later. But for the soldiers in Missouri, Centralia was a warning, a reminder that this guerrilla war played by different rules, a demonstration of what could happen when conventional tactics met unconventional enemies. The warning was heeded. Future engagements in Missouri were conducted with more caution, more firepower, more understanding of what they were facing. But the 124 did not benefit from those improvements. They were already dead. Let us talk about what Centralia represents. It represents the danger of assumptions. Johnston assumed his numbers meant victory. He was wrong. It represents the importance of understanding your enemy. Johnston did not understand guerrilla tactics or weapons. That ignorance killed him. It represents the gap between doctrine and reality. Johnston followed the book. The book was wrong, and it represents the human cost of military error. 124 men died because one officer made one wrong decision. That is the weight of command. The knowledge that a single order can mean life or death for dozens or hundreds of people. Johnston bore that weight. He just did not bear it well enough. Major Johnston has no monument at Centralia. There is a marker for the massacre, a small indication of what happened there. But Johnston himself is largely forgotten. He was not a famous general, not a celebrated hero. He was a competent officer who made one catastrophic error and paid for it with his life. History remembers his failure, but not his name, remembers the numbers, but not the man. 147 soldiers, 124 dead, 5-to-1 odds turned into total defeat. That is how Johnston is remembered, as a warning, as an example, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence. It is not a noble legacy, but it is an instructive one. The horses were the final tragedy. When the Union cavalry dismounted, every fourth man became a horseholder. These men led the horses to the rear, away from the fighting. When the skirmish line collapsed, the horseholders ran too. They released the animals and fled for their lives. The horses scattered across the Missouri countryside. Some were captured by guerrillas. Some wandered until farmers found them. Some were never recovered. 147 horses. The Union Army's investment in mounts, training, and equipment lost along with the men. The material cost of the disaster was significant. The human cost was incalculable. What if Bill Anderson had lost? It is worth considering the counterfactual. What if Johnston had charged? What if the guerrillas had been routed? What if Bill Anderson had been killed or captured that afternoon? The train massacre would still have happened. 24 Union soldiers would still be dead. Centralia would still be burned into Missouri's memory. But Bill Anderson would not have become the legend he became, would not have inspired the same fear, would not have been remembered as the guerrilla who humiliated the Union Army. And Jesse James, watching the engagement, might have learned different lessons, might have seen that guerrilla tactics could be beaten, might have chosen a different path after the war. But Bill did not lose, he won. Decisively, completely, and the lessons of that victory shaped what came after. The engagement at Centralia influenced post-war outlawry. Jesse James and Frank James both rode in that charge. Both saw how 30 men could destroy 147 with the right tactics. Both understood the power of speed and firepower. When the James brothers turned to robbery after the war, they applied what they had learned. Quick strikes, multiple weapons, overwhelming firepower against unprepared targets. The banks they robbed, the trains they stopped, the posses they evaded. All of it drew on lessons learned at Centralia. Bill Anderson taught them how to fight. The Union cavalry taught them how to win. The price of that education was paid in blood by men who had done nothing wrong except follow orders. Let us conclude with the numbers one more time. 147 Union soldiers, 124 dead, 23 survivors, 80 guerrillas in the charge, 2 guerrilla dead, 20 minutes of fighting, 1 fatal decision. These numbers tell the story of Centralia. The story of how overwhelming advantage can become crushing defeat. The story of how doctrine and training can fail against an enemy who does not play by the rules. The story of how one man's confidence led 124 men to their graves. Major Johnston screamed the order that morning: dismount, form a line, prepare to fire. He expected victory, expected his numbers to carry the day, expected the guerrillas to break under disciplined volley fire. He got none of those things. What he got was a charge of 80 horsemen, a storm of revolver fire, a collapse of everything he had built. What he got was death, his own, and 123 others. The last thing Johnston saw was Bill Anderson's guerrillas riding through his broken line, firing, slashing, killing with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Then he saw nothing at all. This is the story of the cavalry battle at Centralia. Not the train massacre, not the execution of unarmed prisoners, but the military engagement that followed. The engagement that should have been a Union victory. That could have been a Union victory. That would have been a Union victory if one officer had made one different decision. But he did not. Johnston dismounted, gave up his mobility, created a stationary target, and Bill Anderson charged. 20 minutes later, 124 men were dead, and the most lopsided cavalry engagement of the Civil War was complete. What should we remember about Centralia? We should remember that numbers lie, that 5-to-1 odds mean nothing if tactics are wrong. We should remember that doctrine is not scripture, that the book can be wrong, that following orders is not enough when orders do not fit the situation. We should remember that guerrilla warfare requires guerrilla thinking, that conventional tactics against unconventional enemies produce unconventional results. And we should remember the 124, the men who followed Johnston into that field, who obeyed his orders, who died because he was confident and wrong. They did not choose to dismount, did not choose to face revolvers with single-shot carbines, did not choose to stand still while horsemen charged, but they died anyway. That is the tragedy of command, the power to send men to their deaths with a single order. Johnston had that power. He used it badly, and 124 families paid the price. The sun set over Centralia on September 27, 1864. The guerrillas had ridden away. The survivors had fled or hidden. The dead lay where they had fallen, waiting for the burial detail that would come the next day. Bill Anderson was miles away, celebrating his victory, planning his next raid, living on borrowed time that would run out in exactly 6 weeks. But for this one day he was triumphant. He had stopped a train, massacred prisoners, destroyed a cavalry unit, killed more than 150 Union soldiers. It was the peak of his career, the moment when Bloody Bill Anderson was the most feared man in Missouri. It was also the moment that guaranteed his death. That sealed his fate. That made the Union Army's determination to kill him absolute. But that is a story for another video. This story ends with Johnston, with 124 dead, with the proof that numbers do not always win. Major Johnston screamed charge and ordered his men to dismount. 147 trained cavalry against 30 guerrillas. 20 minutes later, 124 of them were dead. That is the lesson of Centralia. That is what happens when doctrine meets reality and loses. That is what happens when confidence becomes catastrophe. Remember the numbers. Remember the mathematics. Remember that 5-to-1 is meaningless when tactics are wrong. And remember the dead. One final detail. When Bill Anderson's body was displayed after his death 6 weeks later, Union soldiers lined up to see it. They spat on it, they cursed it, some reportedly stabbed it, but some just stood and stared. These were soldiers who had heard about Centralia, who knew men who had died there, who understood what Bill Anderson had done. They looked at his body and tried to understand. How had this man done it? How had 30 become 80? How had 5-to-1 become a massacre the other way? How had this ordinary-looking corpse been responsible for so much death? They found no answers in his dead face. The answers were in tactics, in weapons, in the fatal decision of an officer who did not understand what he was facing. The answers were in the mathematics of revolvers versus carbines. The answers were in the 20 minutes that destroyed Johnston's command. Bill Anderson took those answers to his grave, but the lesson remained. Never underestimate an enemy who fights by different rules. Never assume that numbers equal victory. Never give your enemy the battle they want. Johnston forgot these lessons, or never learned them. 124 men died as a result. This has been the story of Major Johnston's last command, the story of how 147 became 23, the story of how charge became massacre, the story of Centralia. Remember it, learn from it, do not repeat it. End